Hello out there. We are on the air and we are thrilled to bring you this discussion, or will it turn into a debate, between two influential figures in the pro-liberty movement. I'll let them introduce themselves here in a second. I'm your moderator, Trevor Krause, story editor with Students for Liberty. And we want to remind you that this is a sneak peek of what you'll see at LibertyCon in Miami on October 14th and 15th. And if you're interested in attending, get 50% off your attendance fee using the code LearnLiberty at libertycon.org. That's 50% off your attendance fee at LibertyCon using the code LearnLiberty at libertycon.org. And with that, we bring you Libertarianism versus Neoliberalism, Closer Than We Think, with Bastiat. He goes by Warren now, and Spike Cohen. Spike, why don't you introduce yourself first to our audience?
Thanks, Trevor. Thanks. I appreciate that. I am Spike Cohen. I was the Libertarian Party vice presidential candidate in 2020 and proud vice presidential bronze medalist. And I am now the founder and chair of You Are the Power, which is a grassroots issues-based political organizing group that we started. And if you'd like to be a part of that, go to youarethepower.net. And I'm happy to have this discussion. I'm really looking forward to it.
And Warren, how about you?
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Trevor. I'm looking forward to talking with you, Spike. My name is Warren Ray. I go by Bastiat here on the World Wide Web, although clearly I'm doing a little bit of a branding shift here. And I am here to speak on behalf of neoliberalism, a nebulous term perhaps, if ever there was one, but one I look forward to talking a little bit more about. In my daytime, I am I'd say quintessential neoliberal. I work in the corporate law sector, energy in particular, and I stream on Twitch now and then, and I'm available all the time on Twitter at twitter.com/everyday Bastiat, Bastiat. So I'm looking forward to today's discussion.
And your Twitter profile includes something along the lines of Chief Neoliberal Shill.
True.
What does that mean, real quick?
So about a year and a half ago, I participated in, you see, the Neoliberal Project is a great political organization which I loosely affiliate myself with. I'm not here speaking on their behalf, but I enjoy their work. And they run a contest, an election, as it were, for Chief Neoliberal Shill. A lot of great people in that election, a lot of economists, political speakers, and extremely online posters. Though I dream of myself as a participant in a movement of sorts, am an extremely online poster, in addition to all the rest of how I describe myself. And through several rounds of intense competition, I secured the highest vote round after round to become the duly elected Chief Neoliberal Shill. And we started a lot of great Twitter drama afterward to really kind of live up to the name. So a lot of communists, a lot of fun.
Yes.
Well, we're thrilled to have you, and Spike, we're thrilled to have you as well. And today's discussion is going to touch on things like the role of corporations and international political organizations, and the role of billionaires, the size and scope of the welfare state, each of your ideologies' approach to environmentalism and to freedom of speech. But let's start just broadly. Spike, let's start with you. What would you say are some of the similarities and differences between neoliberalism and libertarianism?
Well, I think Warren said it best. Neoliberalism is such a nebulous term, and frankly, so is libertarianism, that it's kind of hard to answer that. I think probably the best thing I can do is just give my definition of libertarianism. Warren can give his of neoliberalism, and we can see where they align. Because one thing I've learned about libertarianism, and I suspect it's the same with neoliberalism, is that one thing that all libertarians agree on is that none of us actually know who a real libertarian is. So I'll give you my take on it. My take on libertarianism, the elevator pitch version, is we believe that people do best when they're most free. And we think that if you look at the source of most of the problems that we're facing right now, it's because people aren't free and there's too much hands in the power in the hands of too few people. If you expand that out a little bit further, libertarians believe in ideas like personal autonomy, non-aggression, the idea of self-ownership, that you own yourself, your body, your life, you have the rights to the things you say and think. You own your labor, and of course the product of your labor, which is your property, and that we owe each other only non-aggression towards one another. The short version is don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. And so the concepts behind libertarianism all kind of come out of that we all have our own bit of autonomy and ownership, and that we do best when we respect that ownership between each other, and work together voluntarily through persuasion and cooperation and competition instead of through force and coercion and theft.
And Warren, how would you put neoliberalism?
Well, I will say, first of all, as for myself, I would consider myself to be really in the neoliberal school of the neoliberal movement, as it were. That is to say, I don't consider myself somebody who is merely sort of a Democrat in a different shade of clothing, but somebody who really goes back to the Milton Friedman kind of tradition of thinking about the role of government in our society. And so I would say that I, broadly speaking, appreciate and agree with a lot of what Spike just said. But I'd say that if I were going to define what the big difference would be, as somebody proposing another idea, it would be the role of institutions of different types, particularly government institutions, in making freedom work. I think Schumpeter, in his various writing on capitalism, said it best that capitalism contains within it some of the mechanisms for its own self-destruction. If people feel like they've got a fundamental degree of insecurity, inability to predict how the future will work out, eventually capitalism loses the confidence of citizens, who move toward more collectivist ideas on the right and on the left. And therefore, institutions are very important in ensuring that we can get all the benefits of a free market society, but nevertheless maintain those benefits long and into the future. It arises out of a historical reaction, in essence, to the 19th century laissez-faire capitalism that came to a frightful end as many people in Europe and the United States looked at the wars and the Great Depression and concluded, well, the system just doesn't work. Now, I think that's that was a fundamentally mistaken conclusion by folks like that. But it is true that government has an important role to play in ensuring, for example, basic price stability, basic law and order, not just at home, but in the world writ large as well, to some degree, through international institutions and participation in such institutions to protect the environment, not necessarily from humans, of course, but on behalf of humans, so that we can address the third-party harms that I think most libertarians would themselves agree with are something that government has some role to play in minimizing. So there's a lot to it, but ultimately I think it's about saying that we want a free society, and we recognize that sometimes government has a role to play in ensuring the viability of that free society for the long term, and as a result, we need to participate in institutions productively and make them the best we can be.
Okay, well said for both of you. And so I think this is going to make for a really lively and interesting discussion, because I clearly see some overlap, but obviously there are some differences. And on our Learn Liberty YouTube channel, we actually made a video called "What is Neoliberalism and is it worth reclaiming or rejecting?" So this is a subject that I'm personally very interested in. And let's start with what's on the tip of everybody's tongue these days, which is inflation. As we all know, it's at a 40-year high. We're looking at a threat of a recession. Warren, what do you think the role of the government should be in avoiding or correcting inflation? And then, Spike, I'll ask you to respond to what Warren says.
Sure. Well, generally speaking, I think that if you look at price stability and economic crises over, say, the long sweep of American history going back 200 years, we have seen kind of more stability over the longer term and less of the panics that used to define kind of pretty ordinary economic life in the United States. I think those are important to minimize, not just because of the economic outcomes, but because um, economic instability, I think, leads to eventually, as Europe tragically has found throughout the 20th century, political instability, and that leads to the loss of freedom for everyone. So I think some degree of economic stability and preservation there is important, and therefore I think that it's important we have some kind of institution that along the lines of the Federal Reserve that does that. The question is, how should it do that? How should it carry out that project, and toward what end? I'd say that I believe the kind of the old argument by Milton Friedman that inflation is a monetary phenomenon everywhere and always, and that when the creation of money outpaces the creation of output, you get inflation. So the real question, I think, is what do we do in response to that? We reduce the quantity of the money supply through the measures I think that the Federal Reserve is now starting to take. And those are difficult measures to take because they have economic consequences of their own that people don't always like. But I think the reason that it's I suppose another question that's worth considering is, why did the inflation happen? Right? Was it because of the printing of money to deal with COVID-19? I mean, seems logical enough, given that that was the real change after almost 30, I'd say, about 30 years of almost uninterrupted low inflation. Well, was that worthwhile? Was that a worthwhile policy response to COVID-19 to create all that money to try and respond to COVID outbreak? Well, I would argue it was, but that means that as a result, to handle that printing of that addition to money supply, I've got to remove from it. I think there are some folks kind of on the modern monetary theory side of things. We don't hear too much from them anymore now that inflation is back, who have this idea that you could print forever and there would really be no consequence and that money is fake. I certainly don't believe that. I think ultimately the government has an important role to play in the stability of the monetary supply. It added to and had a big role in resulting in inflation, and now it has to contract that supply accordingly.
Yeah, I think something like 40% of all U.S. dollars in existence
almost half
were created since the beginning of 2020, since COVID began.
And add one final point to that. Prior to the addition of the money supply, there was a lot of argument that there was room to go to some degree in adding to the monetary supply because output had actually outpaced that. Now, I don't know that that's true or not, but I know that there was at least some argument at the time that we had some room to go. And I think I know Noah Smith, Bloomberg columnist who writes a pretty popular Substack, made the argument that it's hard to tell ultimately where that ceiling is, where you outpace output and then get into inflation. But in any event, we know we're there now, and the solution is what it was in the 80s, really. Contract money supply.
That argument's basically dead at this point. Like the argument that we should have printed out even more money. We see what we got with this. This was just, I know we might be talking about this later, but this was just a hint of modern monetary supply. The idea of having the government guarantee a basic income for like 2 months. And all the things that came from that. And I think yes, the fact that nearly half of all the money that's ever been created ever, or all the Federal Reserve notes that have ever been created ever, were created since COVID-19. I think that was the biggest single part of it. But you also have to couple that with the fact that with the lockdown measures and with the so-called COVID mitigation measures, which I think at this point we can all safely conclude that there was little, for whatever mitigation happened as a result of it, because this is an endemic virus, in the long term, it really didn't make any kind of difference, and it caused all sorts of immeasurable harm in both the short term and the long term. One of those more long-term harms that was done is that while they are simultaneously pumping all sorts of money into the economy, which, if all other things are left the same, where you have the same amount of goods and services with way more money chasing those same goods and services, that's already going to make the price of things go up just on its own. But when you couple that with paying people not to work and mandating that a good number of people not work, at least for some certain period of time, which causes disruptions in the labor force and in the supply chain that we're seeing now and we'll probably see for years to come, when you literally intentionally reduce the supply while simultaneously increasing the demand by handing people money and increasing the cost of that demand, of course you're going to see the kind of rampant inflation we're seeing right now. So I think we probably agree there. I think where we may disagree is that there is a need for a Federal Reserve. I think that we obviously, and this probably speaks to a bigger disagreement that Warren and I have. I think it's obvious that we do need institutions. I am not impressed with the argument that that institution should be a government-based one. And the reason for that is all of the monetary decisions that were being made were not being made for economic reasons per se. They were being made for political reasons. They were being made because Donald Trump wanted to get reelected, and that both Democrats and Republicans in Congress wanted to get reelected, and the people at the state capitals wanted to get reelected. And so that played out in economically illiterate policies that libertarians, and I'm sure neoliberals and many other people with common sense were warning were going to cause exactly this to happen. But that's what happens when you have a government institution making these decisions, because their decisions are funded by theft. They do not have to demonstrate actual value to the public. The only feedback mechanism is for you to just replace this crony-sponsored politician with this crony-sponsored politician instead of just finding a completely different provider to begin with. And so I think that, Warren mentioned stability, and there certainly has been stability. But especially in the period since 1971, when Nixon finally took us off of the gold standard with the ending of Bretton Woods, we have seen this sort of slow decline of the middle class. It has been a steady one, but it has been a very slow decline of the middle class, where there is an increasing number of middle class, two-income households that cannot afford the cost of living, even before all of this most recent inflation. And I think that points to the fact that having a coercive entity, a coercive monopoly in charge of something like the money supply is going to lead to these kinds of political decisions that cause catastrophic consequences that they're not then held accountable for in any real way. I think in the short term, the Fed raising the rates is the best thing they can do right now. I think in the long term, we need to decide who should we be. Should we have the market deciding what money is, or should we have governing entities making that decision? And I know that the Federal Reserve is technically a private entity, but its governors are appointed by the president. It is very much a political entity, and it's at best it is a public-private partnership, and I would argue it's really just an arm of the government.
Yeah, as someone who's not didn't study economics, certainly I'm kind of picking everything up as I go. I've always thought, and Warren, I'd like to get your thoughts. I've always thought it's hard to envision the economy as like this faucet, or this series of faucets that you can turn. The Fed will turn interest rates one way, and it'll turn the other tap the other way to try to create stability. So what do you think? Can the economy, something as big and complex as a country's economy, be micromanaged like that?
Well, the thing with the Federal Reserve is I don't purport to be an expert in all things monetary, but what the Federal Reserve does is not really, I'd say, micromanagement in the way that we might envision most of central planning, although, of course, it is a kind of central planning, and therefore, sort of a reflexive anathema to myself and certainly, of course, to Spike. But, I think that there are reasons that we want to have an institution like that anyway, but I'll get into that. It buys and sells securities. It's not, it's not getting involved in the, individual businesses, really, for the most part. The Paycheck Protection Program, for example, was a project of Congress, and the creation of money by the Federal Reserve helped fund that. But the Congress, I think, is ultimately the institution I would say is engaged in much more micromanagement of the economy than, say, the Federal Reserve, which is ultimately,
I agree.
Ultimately is providing the through the way it operates, helps provide resources that Congress then uses to micromanage, but which itself I think is doing pretty basic stuff, and which I know Milton Friedman made the argument that you could replace it with a computer that would adjust the quantity of the money supply up and down by some percentage based on just a couple of different factors. Basically just responsive, take all the political dimension out of it, and it would be purely an economic institution. So inflation goes up, okay, we reduce. Inflation goes down, okay, we increase a little bit, and keep just as consistent as possible a system in place. Now, I understand that's a tough thing, of course, to expect in really any society, that we're going to hand off decision making to basically a machine. That's a,
It would be better.
question.
It would.
I think that would often be the
It would be
case, that it would, but I think that short of that ambition, the Federal Reserve having a mandate to basically stabilize prices and maintain, keep employment from going through the floor is a pretty limited mandate. It seems to me that the problems that we've described here, well, I guess there are a couple things I'm going to get into, because Spike, you said a lot. I think would go over a lot of differences here that we would have. So first of all, I guess the early days of COVID are, to me, a lot different than the later days of COVID. The first couple months, maybe from March to May of 2020, when this stuff has gone on in China now for a couple of months, the Chinese Communist Party has characteristically lied and deceived and covered up, and it's tearing through European hospitals. They are crowded, and you get these footage of people just like choking on their own lungs in the hallways in hospitals in Italy. And then we get it here in the United States. And while we know now a lot more about it, like you said, an endemic, it's never really going to go away. At the time, we just didn't really know a lot of this stuff. And I'm curious, just kind of as a first question, I could understand a lot of the responses to COVID that were done right away, where you would say, all right, we're going to have a lockdown for a month because this thing is tearing through. We don't know much about it except for what we do know, which is that it's kind of scary, and we have only so many resources on hand to deal with it, and therefore, we should take some kind of limited time measure to handle it. To me, it seemed like the problem with most of those measures was that in places where they dragged on beyond that, like Florida did a very limited lockdown, and places though that went beyond Florida, that went for months and months and months, after it became clear that there was really only so much you could do. I mean, I guess, is it your position that we should have taken no actions in response through government to COVID-19?
It's my position. My position is the same now as it was when I made my first anti-lockdown video at the end of either end of February or beginning of March, before the lockdowns had even started here, which is that if government is to do anything, it is to provide up-to-the-minute information and its recommendations that it would then recommend to people. And if it's to do anything, if government should have been doing anything, it was looking at the supply chain and bottlenecks that it was creating with things like protective equipment, getting rid of measures that are driving up the cost of healthcare, like cost plus legislation and other types of things, to look at, okay, how are we getting in the way of the provision of large amounts of intensive emergency care that is likely to happen, and how can we get out of the way of that, while simultaneously providing the kinds of measures that they would recommend individuals and businesses to take, with some very strong guidance there. But the problem is, and this is the stuff I was saying it's funny because the first videos I would put out, people in the comments would go, "You idiot, that's never going to happen here." And like 2 weeks later, when I'm making my second anti-lockdown video and the lockdowns are on their way here, the people are now saying, "You idiot, you're going to kill everyone's grandparents if you do this." But the thing that I said at the time is that you had the federal government was implementing George Bush's, it's actually Anthony Fauci's, but under the Bush administration's 2005 bird flu mitigation measures. And for those who don't know, bird flu had a 90% fatality rate. Now, even at the worst expectations for COVID, we knew it was still in the single digits. It might have been as high as 6, 7, or even 8%, which, I mean, thank God it wasn't, right? Thank God it's a fraction of that. But even if it had been that high, the kind of measures that were recommended for a virus that had a 90% fatality rate, it just doesn't make sense that you would use that. I do understand the fear that led to people saying we should do this, both the policymakers and civilians and citizens thinking that they should do it. But when I and I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm not an expert in this. I did when I first found out about COVID, and I started researching the CDC and what their measures were, what our epidemiological experts recommended for different types of outbreaks and things like that. The conclusion I came to from I don't know, maybe a few hours of research, was that what was likely going to happen was going to lead to the economic disruptions we're seeing and the social disruptions that we're seeing, that it would not do very much in the long term to stop a virus that we knew that was at least as transmissible as the flu, and probably more so, and would certainly evolve to become more transmissible over time. The fact that there was no vaccine that ever stopped a coronavirus, that coronaviruses, because of the rate of how they mutate, it's not possible to be able to put an end to them. But that thankfully they typically mutate into something that becomes more transmissible but less deadly over time. And that, from my conclusion of that back in February, March, I thought lockdowns are wrong, mandates are wrong, give people the right measures that they should be taking. Let them know, and this was another problem that was done. They would present ideas and then say, this is the science, and basically implying, if you don't do this, you're a bad person. And it wasn't the CDC saying that part, but it was the politicians and pundits saying that part. If instead they said, this is the most we know right now, it is subject to change, but here is what we recommend, while they simultaneously looked at all of the red tape and draconian measures that were making it harder for the provision of emergency, intensive emergency services, I think we would have been in a much better place, both with COVID and certainly on the economic front.
Well, I would say that to some degree, I would agree with that. That, for example, a lot of the protective measures, a lot of the regulatory measures that were relieved temporarily, from stuff to production bottlenecks to
absolutely,
like state-created regulatory production bottlenecks, right on down to stuff like curbside purchases of alcohol. A lot of stuff was undone that has, that the whole process has shown to have been arbitrary, wasteful, stuff. But that said, I think that the question here of what is reasonable and what the government's role is seems to be an innately fact-driven question. Like, this wasn't 90% fatal. Just as a simple question, though, suppose it had been, just for this discussion here. I know it's not. But if it had been, if there were a disease that were, spreading that weren't 90% fatal, I mean, surely you would imagine the government response, hey, look, we recognize this is not ideal for a free society, but at a certain point, free societies to buckle a little bit when survival.
Right, you're all going to die. Yeah.
So the thing that gets me is, okay, well, there's a lot of room in between 90% and what we got, right? Now, if people are operating on the theory that, 2 to 3 million Americans could die, and if indeed 1 million Americans did die as a result, even if you want to kind of quibble a bit on some of the edges of those figures, it seems to me that it is hard to say, well, 1 million people are going to die. That's kind of just the cost of business in a free society, and the economic disruptions are not worth it. I think that's the economic disruptions are not worth taking the action. If you know that a pandemic is going to cause some kind of, or if you're operating on the assumption at least that a pandemic is going to cause some large-scale death, as indeed it ultimately did, even if it wasn't what people were expecting, I think it's a hard thing to say, do nothing because the economic, or do much less, do kind of the stuff we were talking about, but don't do the very coercive stuff. That to me seems like a hard thing to say, even for a short period of time. Seems like a hard thing to say. That seems to sort of give up the game of what a democratic society, really any society, since we know the authoritarian societies were far more draconian, China, for example. I mean, people don't want to die of disease. They expect government to do something about it. If we don't do something about it and we just kind of let it tear through, the only country I know of that took that approach, really just kind of the let it rip approach, was Russia. Another authoritarian state, and they lost perhaps over 1 million people in a much smaller country, population-wise.
And Sweden to a certain extent did too.
Sweden as well did. Yeah.
I wanted to push back a little bit, Warren, because it was your pseudonym Bastiat who wrote about the seen and the unseen, right?
Sure.
And all the things that we've seen are the deaths that have resulted from COVID. We won't really see all the agony and death, most likely, that will result from the economic disruption of the economy.
That is a great point, and a very important point. And I think it is unfortunate that a lot of times the argument is made such that, well, you either don't care about human life, or you don't care about human liberty. One or the other. And I guess I would say that while I would say that I would probably be on the same side as Spike with a lot of these restrictions a few months into the pandemic. Right off the bat, a lot of what was done seemed to me to be pretty much in the ordinary course of what we would want government to do when we have limited information and good reasons to be worried about the outcomes from a virus that is very contagious and which has done a lot of damage in a lot of other parts of the world. I think the most salient argument I can see from kind of Spike's approach here of, look, I know this was wrong from the start, is, the government's just not going to give the power back. Once they take it, they're not going to give it back. And I know the example of Australia has certainly made a lot of people feel like that's the case. I'm not sure how that ultimately is resolved. I haven't checked on that, but I mean, that's just not really the case in the United States, at least. I mean, there are some democratic states.
Spike, let's get your response, and then I want to move on to another topic. Spike, briefly, how would you respond to Warren's question?
Yeah, I think there's two aspects here. One is, what is a difficult sell, or what is an easy sell? And yes, especially in a society that has been conditioned to look to government for its solutions, it would be a hard sell to say, hey, look, this is a nasty virus. We're going to make recommendations, but we're not going to tell you and other people what to do because we think it's going to cause more harm than good. And you're going to naturally have people say, but what about the millions that might die? We now have the benefit of knowing that, ultimately 80% of Americans have gotten COVID. The numbers that we were going to get were the numbers we were going to get. Here's where I think that we do disagree, is that I think that just from the basic research I did, and again, I am not an epidemiological expert, I am not a doctor, but from a few hours of mostly researching data from the CDC and other state agencies and a few other sources, I saw coronaviruses are highly transmissible. They become more highly transmissible over time. Vaccines do not stop them. At best, they keep people from dying of them. Thankfully, they become less deadly over time, sometimes very quickly. And that, there isn't a measure that's going to be in place that's going to stop this from ultimately spreading to anyone who doesn't make permanent, decided for themselves life changes to keep from getting it. If you're one of the, 22% of Americans who haven't gotten it, it's not because of lockdowns or mandates. It's because you yourself have chosen to drastically change your lifestyle in order to not get COVID, or you always had the kind of hermited lifestyle that would keep you from getting a disease anyway. It's certainly not from anything from the state. So no, I think even before having the benefit of the knowledge that we have now, I think that a leader and who was also a policymaker who was honest to the people and said, listen, if you look at the data on coronaviruses, if you look at even the data we have now, it is not going to be a good idea to arbitrarily tell people who can and can't be open, and in some cases create the conditions for cold and flu season by telling people to stay home in their poorly poorly circulated, air circulated homes, venturing out only to go to the exact same place that everyone else is going, and only for a certain period of hours every day because of the curfews, and that's somehow going to stop the transmission of illness. No, if I had been an elected official, I would have fought on that hill, and ultimately I would have been proven correct. But it would not have been because of some ideological bent. It would have been from in that case, looking at the data on what coronaviruses are, how these measures work, and just realizing also the fact that government's just not good at carrying out these kind of large-scale things in the first place. So that would be my take on it. But I do get the fear and the concern for. I also understand why in that first couple months people would choose themselves to be a lot more cautious until they find out just how deadly this is, just how serious it is. That makes perfect sense, but that's different from what the measures are that should be taken by an entity that could destroy society if they make the wrong moves. That's my take on that.
Let's leave it there for now.
Well, like,
let's leave it there for now, guys.
Go
ahead, Warren.
I mean, all right. I mean, I guess it seems to me that this is something where your answer just has to be driven based on a reading of the facts rather than a reading of values, because there must be some point where you would say, look, I mean, yeah, this is too much for society to bear, and so we must take some kind of coercive action. Or is it your opinion that no, really, I mean, if it had been 6, 7, 8%, I mean, that's just what it was. Like, I don't know, like, I agree with the morality that you're espousing.
Yeah,
I just reject that it works out in practice to like
you're rejecting
society
the
benefits.
consequential argument.
I will accept. Yeah, it is wrong for the government to say stay at home. But I mean,
Right.
there were in places, for example, correlation between lockdowns and drops in cases. Most of the Europeans suffered less death than we did. We did less that kind of stuff. I understand that we can make sort of. It seems to me that to make it an entirely normative thing and to say the values are such that I would have done this, there has to be a point. I mean, unless you are really a true believer. And I've watched some of your stuff. I know you make some consequentialist arguments, like on abortion, for example. There has to be a point where you say, look, I don't like this stuff either. But I mean, the alternative is, 10 million, 12 million dead. I mean, at some point we make distinctions.
On this one, it's a tough one, because even if you go to the extreme of the 90%, let's say that this had a 90% fatality rate, who the hell's going to go outside in the first place? Like, if we tell people you have a 9 in 10 shot of dying if you go outside, so let's all just try to stay inside for a week or two until this thing blows over. And if you don't, there's a high likelihood you're going to die from it. I mean, let's be frank, the people that would go outside, if we just said that, would be the same people that would go outside during a lockdown. So even from a consequentialist argument, there are things where I could see consequentially where coercion, either through the state or through, even if doesn't line up with our morals and values of how things should go, where it might potentially make things better even in the long term. When it comes to a virus that is this transmissible, I'm not convinced that's the case. I really am not. I know we have to move on, but that's my take on that.
Well, I'll tell you what, guys. We'll pick up this thread in what I think is in a related discussion, and I want to remind all of our viewers out there that this is just a sneak peek of what you'll see in Miami at LibertyCon, October 14th and 15th in Miami, and that if you use the code LearnLiberty at libertycon.org, you'll get 50% off your attendance fee. And both Spike and Warren will be in attendance, and they'll have all the time in the world to go at it for hours and hours. Again, that's
code, which I suspect we may actually.
That's code LearnLiberty at libertycon.org if you'd like 50% off attendance to LibertyCon in Miami, October 14th and 15th. So my related what I suspect might be related. We're talking about lockdowns and government action. Is what approach governments might take to climate change. So each of you, I'd like to get your thoughts on how you think through environmentalism, what governments should or should not be able to do in terms of influencing what energy we use, or even how often people drive their cars. Could the precedents that we saw during COVID for lockdowns establish a precedent for preventing people from driving their cars on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, for example? So, and Spike, let's start with you. How can free market policies protect the environment and do it better than government and central planning?
I think the shortest way I can answer this is if you look at that we have so far, the safest, most environmentally friendly, cheapest, and most carbon neutral form of energy that we have, I would say that deregulating and making cost beneficial again, allowing for the creation of new nuclear power plants, especially some of these next generation ones like thorium salt reactors, which are exponentially less deadly and less environmentally harmful, and equally carbon neutral and even cheaper than the old school technologies we're still relying on now. Allowing for more nuclear energy would do more to reduce climate emissions than any other measure I've heard of. And not only would it not cause any kind of ancillary harm to the economy, it would actually cause a benefit to the economy. You'd have cheaper energy. You would have, which would drastically lower the cost of living. You'd have less reliance on dictatorial foreign regimes for energy, not just here, but around the globe. You would have greater energy grid stability because it is not reliant on environmental conditions. It's just a stable provision of energy for decades at a time per plant, in every measurable way. And also by making energy much cheaper, it would allow for cheaper research on the next generation of renewable and even better forms of energy. So I think that just that one thing would do far better than any of the other measures that I've seen or proposals that I've seen for when it comes to climate change. My fear of any of these ideas, whether it's a cap and trade or a carbon tax or any of the stuff from the Green New Deal, which 90% of the Green New Deal is really just a jobs plan. It really has little to do with the environment. But any of these measures, they look to me like an obvious way to create carve-outs for big businesses and to make their smaller competitors unable to be able to compete, which is inevitably going to just cause even more income inequality, cause even more negative disruptions in the market, cause even more reliance on big business, and ultimately we've seen what government agencies do. When a spill or a leak or anything else happens, first the government tries to work with their crony sponsor partners to cover it up, and if that doesn't work, they give them a slap on the wrist, but then they give them indemnity. They indemnify them against lawsuits, so that they can't be sued out of existence for all the irreparable harm they've caused to people and to the environment. And then they stick us with the bill for whatever mitigation can be done. That clearly doesn't work. So the one measure I could see happening is and we could actually take a page from Murray Rothbard on this, if we treat environmental harm, it would be harder with climate change, but with environmental damage in general, a lot of it there is substantial and demonstrable property harm and health harm and life harm that happens to individuals and communities that they could be sued for. And if it means they get sued out of existence, good, maybe they won't do that in the future. So that's one thing that I could see maybe the government being involved in. I just, in general, when you give government a new gun, they end up pointing it at the people that are the least likely to be able to fight back against it. So I think, deregulating nuclear would do a lot more to help when it comes to climate change, the environment, energy security, national security, and a lot of other things too.
Hey, I agree with some of that, but a lot of that I wouldn't. And I'll preface this by saying that for some time, perhaps I still am, I was known as the oil lawyer, although I've never worked in oil. But that was one of the things I used to lean into a little bit on Twitter, being an oil lawyer. And of course, naturally, people find that to be very evil. Although, of course, I think it's a very noble profession for those who practice it. I work in natural gas, though. And I guess I would say that I appreciate the discussion of nuclear energy, because a lot of what you said about nuclear energy is absolutely true. Once the plants are built, they are incredibly safe. They're very efficient. The electricity that they generate is very cheap. And really, you're limited by, in the sense of generating the electricity, the life of the plant, which, they last for quite a while if they're properly maintained, and the supply of the fissile material, which is something that, it's another matter. But there's no real prospect of that running out, I think, in our lifetimes, although But anyway, the challenge, though, is that nuclear power has a lot of externalities and challenges that are not really the ones that are often attacked, like the radioactive threat of radioactivity, but that nevertheless do require a lot of robust government involvement. For example, I know you mentioned that the government will often protect large, I think, oil companies from being sued out of existence. Ultimately, a nuclear power plant has to be given the same guarantees in order for a private company to build it, or else it's really, the prospect of building something that's safe is a good prospect. But it is also important to weigh it against how it works out, when it does very rarely, but occasionally have a real disaster. I mean, the kind of economic outcome from that is it's incredible. And that's why Congress requires nuclear power companies to, they have to insure themselves some point, but ultimately the Congress says, after a certain point, we will cover everything. There's no way around that, because if they are, I guess there's two ways around that. One, the way around that is to have some kind of open-ended conditional guarantee that says, hey, build this plant. We know it's going to be much more good than bad. And if something, God forbid, unlikely, we have Fukushima here, we'll cover you. The alternative is that the plant just wouldn't get built. And indeed, the real tragedy of nuclear power is that regulation has compounded some of its existing challenges. the startup costs for a nuclear power plant they're just expensive because this is high technology, and the new reactors have a lot of potential there, but they nevertheless have high startup costs. And so governments have tried to do things to encourage the construction of nuclear plants. For example, here in Florida, we have a program that the utility companies can engage in merely the planning of a nuclear power plant. You'll like this one, Spike, I think. The planning of a nuclear power plant, and they can be guaranteed some kind of return on that, even if the plant doesn't get built. Well, of course, there turned out to be a flurry of planning. And yet you can understand why, to some degree, programs like this are tried, because nuclear power has so many benefits like that, and yet it is really expensive. And it isn't just the regulations that make it expensive, although the regulations do make it much more expensive and difficult than it would otherwise be. They certainly compound all of that. They should be rolled back substantially. We have, for example, a regulatory program called, I think, ALARA, A-L-A-R-A. That means basically nuclear power doesn't get cheaper as it gets more efficient, because it has to always provide the smallest amount of radioactive emissions possible under existing technology. And so as the technology gets better and it gets cleaner, they nevertheless have to continually invest in more to further reduce, because they have to get that figure as low as technologically possible. So even if they get it really low, if technology advances, they got to spend more money to get it even lower, even if they're going beyond any reasonable risk. And of course, compare this to coal, the burning of which leads to the not just carbon, which I agree is a big threat, climate change and all that, but in the much more tangible and easy to understand risk that nobody really argues with, the particulate matter that results from the burning of coal that kills so many thousand people a year. And yet that is a hard thing to get around without government having some involvement there. Because when you're dealing with something like, say, my favorite fuel, natural gas is just way cheaper than nuclear power is right now. And natural gas is probably, I don't know if it's as big as the regulatory hurdle or not, but it is a huge reason why nuclear power plants are just not going up, because natural gas is cheaper. It's really easy to stop the plant, start the plant, stop the plant, start the plant. The infrastructure is mostly there, although government has restricted the creation of new infrastructure, which has given us some bottlenecks. That's another issue. And here, I guess I would say that while I agree with a lot of what you said about these benefits to nuclear power, I'll tell you, the free market has reduced carbon emissions by replacing coal with cheaper natural gas. And yet we probably can't make the transition from natural gas to nuclear unless either natural gas gets way more expensive or government does something to, add some kind of fudge factor, well-intentioned or not, that makes nuclear power just, the startup costs are worth it. It's a thing where I think the free market is working, but it's only, that cleaner situation you described, it's just not going to go for that.
So more philosophically, guys, let me put a proposition to you, and Spike, I want to hear what you think, and then Warren, because Warren, it sounds like you're arguing for more intervention on the politician's part than Spike is, but on the other hand, Spike himself is a politician. So if I said to each of you, least qualified group of people to handle a problem on the scale of hundreds or thousands of years as climate change is, the least qualified group of people are those who see things in 2, 4, and 6 year cycles. How would you respond to that, Spike?
Well, I mean, that is the problem, right? Is that politicians often, and it's funny because I'm trying to be more of a political activist than a politician, but that was a fair charge there, Trevor. That hit me where I think you wanted it to. No, I think that the thing with politicians is they're driven by political concerns. They're also often not very smart. And some of the dumbest people I've ever met in my life are elected officials. They don't really know what they're talking about. They're handed talking points. They are, as they work their way up the food chain, where you would hope that they become smarter, they actually become dumber because they become more and more reliant on just being handed whatever talking points their campaign teams / the cronies that are sponsoring them give them. And then, yes, even if they are smart, they are primarily concerned with getting reelected. And then there's also all the political machinations, the so-called sausage making of, I know this is the best way to move forward, but I'm going to compromise on that to try to get this done. It's really just not a good way to make these kinds of societal decisions. Now, going back on, I think our difference here, I think it's less on what we think, what level of, there may be some difference on the level of government regulation or lack thereof. But I think honestly, it was more of a debate on whether natural gas or nuclear is the better way to do things. And what I'll say to that is, I would say let's let the market bear it out. My understanding on things like thorium salt reactors and things like that is that it so well addresses some of the problems from the I guess first and second generation nuclear plants that it becomes so much cheaper and so much, especially so much safer, that a lot of those externality concerns aren't as bad as they were with some of the older ones. I can tell you firsthand. So I live in South Carolina, and we were going to have a nuclear power plant built here. And everything was set up, all of the licensing was gotten and everything else. But then the Obama administration, their EPA, changed the rules mid-flight and made it cost prohibitive. And so now the South Carolina taxpayers are on the hook for, I believe, a couple $2 billion with no power plant to show for it. And that was as a direct result of federal intervention to kill that power plant. Whether nuclear or natural gas, or I would suspect some combination of all of the above, is the best way to do it. I leave that to the market. And I'm not an energy expert, but I will say, just in general, I would say that the creation of more nuclear plants in general would do more to combat climate change than any of the measures from government that I'm seeing in the forms of like carbon taxes, cap and trade, Green New Deal, and so forth. Now, that's the point I was making specific to nuclear, but I'm not against natural gas. I'm not against it. I mean, we need to be getting energy how we can get energy.
Well, I think this actually is really interesting, because this, you're right that I think talking about it, I didn't finish the thought that I think I would like to have finished, which is this. I think that this discussion gets to the different view of what government should do. I don't think, ultimately, I don't think it's possible to deliver energy without a serious role for government that is probably above and beyond what it would ordinarily be in a lot of things. For example, the nature of the utility business is such that we either have to have multiple competing pipelines, or we have to have one set of somewhat regulated pipelines that multiple people, and this is the same with power lines, the same with other types of infrastructure. We either have to say, you can exclude as you see fit without consequence, and therefore have to have duplicative extra infrastructure, makes energy cost more, would require the use of more resources, or we say, okay, government is going to regulate how the use of this infrastructure works, so that you have to allow equal access by providers here. So, for example, in Texas, the electricity system is what they call deregulated, which means that the grid is regulated in such a way that they don't have a price-controlled monopoly that provides electricity, but they have different competing companies that provide electricity at different prices. They provide different products. And at least until the winter storm a couple of years ago, that was another matter, it was generally regarded as a pretty effective system. Now, that kind of system, though, still requires a lot of government involvement, because government has to regulate in a way that keeps the people using the infrastructure from cheating the system, that ensures that the system owner is getting adequately compensated, that ensures that everybody is using the system in such a way that it's not overloaded. Like, there are a lot of rules and regulations that go into making it possible to have what I would say is greater freedom, that is, say, greater choice in where you as an individual get your energy from. Another example, I think, is the question of where do we get our energy from more generally, right? Should it be natural gas? Should it be nuclear? Well, a lot of that comes down to what kind of rules should we have? What should government's role be? And my view is that some government action is bad and some is good, and depends on what kind it is. When it is government action that is based on an ill-conceived, ill-informed notion of safety, like, for example, the regulations that have helped strangle nuclear power for the last 50 years in this country. Of course, after the after the creation of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, I don't believe we built a new nuclear reactor since. Only in Georgia have they recently. They're looking like they're going to finish those. It has some challenges, but the whole institution has been a real mess accordingly. But it is important to recognize that nevertheless there would have to be some important role for government for nuclear power to work at all, to ensure that the resources could be, the construction of power lines, transportation of dangerous substances, the storage of dangerous substances. Because, of course, we know that while I don't really disagree with the argument generally that politicians are, quote unquote, dumb, I disagree with the argument that really there's anybody else out there who's demonstrably much smarter. I think we all have our blind spots. We all make our mistakes. I think we're driven primarily, more by incentives than innate abilities. And that, it's as easy as it is to imagine imagine government taking advantage of something, issuing some kind of ill-informed arbitrary rule. It is also the case, and I hate to say this as a professional corporate shill, that sometimes corporations will take a shortcut and dump toxic waste somewhere it doesn't belong, because what are you going to fucking do about it, buddy? So and I don't say that because I think corporations are bad, just human beings like everybody else.
It can happen, and they
I think
motive.
And I think mostly they try and do good. I think most people in government try and do good. I think it's more just a question of incentives. So we got to focus on getting the right rules rather than just saying government needs to get out. Because
I'm glad you brought up that point, and I know, Trevor, you probably want to move on to another subject, so
we only have a few minutes left too. So
so I do want to say, it's not that the individual politician or the individual corporate CEO or whatever are uniquely better or worse people. It's the systems under which they are operating, and therefore the incentives that are being driven. I believe that a profit motive that is absent any kind of government-based coercion, a profit motive is likely to lead to more service to the consumer and the everyday person than a politician making political calculations and knowing that they have no real accountability for it. And it's not market forces that are determining whether they stay in office or not. It is their ability to manipulate the political system. And I think that government as an entity has proven itself to be a uniquely terrible way of doing things. So do we need things like a public utility? Yeah, I don't think that having 15 different power lines is the best way to do this. Although there could maybe be some duplication that might be helpful from a competitive standpoint. But I think that what I'm saying is these different institutions and these different public entities, I'm not convinced that government, a political process, is the best way to do it. I think the more market-driven, the more voluntary they are, the more likely that things that like measures of competition and market feedback are much better ways of making sure that they stay accountable than the democratic process. I think that's been proven.
I agree with that generally. I would say that's really an important thing to recognize, that generally speaking, the democratic process, like Milton Friedman used to say, we're voting on what color tie we're going to get. In a market, you can get a green one, you can get a blue one. We've all heard that it endures because it's true. The only difference is, I think it's important to recognize that minority of things, though it is a minority, it is real. That minority of areas that, for a variety of reasons, sometimes subtle, sometimes gross, requires unique forms of government involvement. And I think the attitude of government always bad, it's always going to make things worse, is a problem, because the end result is that government, I think, does get worse. You get worse people who go into it. It's a little more craven than it would otherwise be. And I think it's important that if we're going to have a government that does things, that it does those things that it should be doing as well as it possibly can, because that's its role. That's why it's taxing us. And if we look at something like government involvement in, say, dealing with the environment, and just say, well, less is better, more is worse, or vice versa, I don't think that's the answer. The Soviet Union, for example, the worst climate criminal, environmental criminal in the history of the world. You got to read about they were a much poorer society than the United States, and yet the amount of carbon emissions per person was far higher. Yep. The damage they did to meet their central planning, right? So that's an example of the tragedy of government being involved in the environment. That degree of government is always going to lead to worse outcomes than even the kind of, I'd say, I'm not, what I would argue is a society that has, no rules is going to have bad outcomes, right? Like the rivers catching fire in the 70s in the United States and such. No rules on this stuff at the time. But some amount of regulation and government involvement can get us to where I think we are here in the United States and most developed countries, where we've got a much cleaner environment, where people have generally clean air, and where we're making progress on climate change. And I think that we're not going to get that without some government involvement, because these are complex systems that require the degree of voluntary cooperation that would be involved to make them possible with no coercion of any kind. It's just, I'd say, generally speaking, beyond human capacity.
And that's a great jumping off point for my final question. I know we're coming up on our time limit, but this has been such a lively discussion, and I do want to save some for Miami, because as a reminder to our
We're
viewers,
saving plenty for Miami.
this is only the tip of the iceberg. This is just a sneak peek. Both of our participants, or combatants, if you will be in Miami for LibertyCon, October 14th and 15th, and you can get 50% off of your attendance fee at libertycon.com. I misspoke earlier. It's libertycon.com, not .org. Libertycon.com, using the code LearnLiberty. That'll get you 50% off your attendance fee for LibertyCon in Miami, October 14th and 15th. And guys, just very quick, you've been very generous with your time already. My last question was about free speech and misinformation. Is it safe to assume that you have similar stances to how the government should intervene or not in what we might call misinformation wars?
I'd say probably, actually, on this.
Probably.
I don't really see much role for government here at all.
No.
I think that
for government to limit the capability, let's say, of bad actors.
No, I mean, even to the point where, and I imagine maybe we'll talk about this in October, where we might disagree on this, the issue of Russia and Ukraine. A lot of European countries said Russia Today is no longer allowed, the Russian state TV network. I wouldn't ban that. As far as I could see in terms of response even to that, and the reason I bring that up is, to me, that's kind of the highest example of a danger of misinformation, is an actual state whose government is trying to, they're trying to do harm to us, or the state's policy, I'm not saying Russian, but the state's policy is to do some kind of harm. Then even there, though, I don't see the reason why the case for the government to get involved that would possibly outweigh the risk of that. The only one I can see for limitations of information is when it's unusual kinds of situations. Like, for example, TikTok. The problem with TikTok is not really that it, I think, promotes some Chinese communist propaganda, but apparently it also collects people's information without their knowing, like even in violation of its own terms of service. Something like that maybe would have a case for government involvement, but generally speaking, I don't see the case, because the harm is just far and away, like, the principle here can be exercised in almost perfect wholeness with very little risk.
100%. Yeah. And a lot of the problems with censorship that we're seeing from social media are actually, it's the tail wagging the dog. You have government entities that are pressuring them to do this, threatening them with dragging them in front of Congress. I once wrote something, I don't even remember what it was. It had nothing to do with Germany, and I got an email letting me know that the German government was investigating through Twitter whether I had broken German election misinformation laws. And I got a email, I think, immediately after that, saying I hadn't, because I wasn't mentioning anything about Germany or its election. But it was the fact that was even a thing, that there's an actual mechanism whereby the German government is looking at all of the tweets on Twitter and basically, if Twitter wants to operate in Germany, they have to comply with this system. That's the real censorship that's happening. And I think you remove that stuff, and that removes a lot of the censorship that we worry about. No, I think like Warren said, this is something where a principle can pretty well be kept across the board. When it comes to his example with TikTok, that's fraud. If they're outside of their own terms and service, terms of service, are collecting information or doing anything else, that's fraud. That's not even a misinformation thing. That's a fraud thing. So no, I think, and we probably both agree on this one. The last people I want telling me what is or is not true is the government. I don't trust them to do that. I think that we to the extent that we can allow information, bad information is combated by more good information, not by a a central planner telling you what is or is not good information. And I just want to close on this by saying this was us barely brushing on 3 topics.
True.
So you need to come to Liberty
I was going to
LibertyCon.
say the same thing. Yeah.
October 13th and 15th, you have to come out. We're likely going to be going at it quite a bit, and so will many others. You got to do it. LibertyCon.com. Use the code LearnLiberty. 50% off. I don't know if anyone else here is Jewish. I am. That's a deal. Okay, I'm telling you right now. You 50%. You don't sniff at 50%. Okay, 50% off. Learn Liberty. We'll see you in Miami. We'll have a great time.
Thank you for doing my work for me.
There's nothing
Warren?
more Jewish than 50% off to go to Miami. Like, that is possibly the most Jewish sentence ever. Learn Liberty at libertycon.com.
Well, guys, I don't think we're going to be able to top that, so let's leave it there. Warren and Spike, can't thank you enough for your time. And as Spike laid out, this is only the very beginning. We will have a blast in Miami. If there's any topics that come up, or I don't know, if there's a big event that'll be taking place just 2 weeks or so after Miami, that might give us some good content. Well, it'll be there for us. So, Spike, Warren, thank you so much, and thank you everyone out there for tuning in.